I remember the smell before anything else. Hospitals always smell like antiseptic and boiled linens. Claudine's ward had that faint metallic tang, too, like copper on the tongue. I had been sleeping in a chair beside her bed, my hands still wrapped in a scratchy hospital blanket. The IV pump clicked every few seconds. That was my soundtrack when I dialed Carmen's number. I was exhausted but hopeful. Claudine's hip surgery had gone well. She was dozing. I thought, finally, I can turn my mind back to Amara, to her graduation, to the moment I had been waiting for since the day she was born. The phone rang once, twice. Then her voice, bright and rehearsed, spilled through the line. "Oh, that was yesterday. We kept it small. Only immediate family." Only immediate family. This could happen to any mother. Subscribe so you don't miss lessons. The words punched the air out of my lungs. I froze, staring at the scuffed tile floor, the phone pressed too tightly against my ear. Yesterday. My lips trembled. I whispered, What do you mean?" Her tone didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. "We didn't want a big fuss, just close family, you understand?" Close family, immediate family. The phrases rang in my ears like church bells gone wrong. I pictured Amara's cap and gown, the corsage I had paid for, the dress, paid for with money I scraped together after selling the last of Robert's tools he had cared for like children. That money turned into fabric and thread, a dress meant for Amara's big day, but I wasn't there to see her wear it. My body went cold. My fingers shook. "Carmen, I didn't even know the date." She chuckled lightly, like I was the silly one. Oh, it must have slipped my mind. Slipped her mind. 2 weeks I had been gone, caring for my sister, checking my phone every night for a message, trusting Carmen to coordinate everyone's schedules, and just like that, I was erased. I hung up before she could say more. For a moment, I just sat there, phone in my lap, the machines beeping around me. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. Then I did the thing every broken-hearted grandmother shouldn't do. I opened Instagram. The first picture hit me like ice water. Amara on stage, certificate in hand, smiling so wide my eyes blurred. Behind her? Carmen's parents who had never paid a dime. Carmen's sister, the one who always rolled her eyes at old people. Even Carmen's ex-boyfriend was there, arm wrapped proudly around his new wife. Everyone was there. Everyone but me. I kept scrolling, my thumb trembling so badly I could barely control it. A professional photographer's watermark stamped every glossy shot, posed group pictures, champagne glasses raised high, my granddaughter hugging everyone but me. Only immediate family. The phrase throbbed in my head like a drum. My phone buzzed again. Trevor, my son, my boy who once clung to me on the first day of kindergarten, terrified to let go of my hand. His voice now was shaky, weak. "Mom, please don't make a scene. Carmen handled everything. Carmen handled everything. Handled the dates. Handled the invitations. Handled me. Like a problem to be shuffled out of the way. Still, some part of me hoped it wasn't true. So I opened TikTok, and there it was, Amara's own montage. A slick little video, her crossing the stage, hugging her parents, her friends, her aunts, uncles, cousins. A perfect, curated life. And me? I wasn't even a shadow. The comments burned. "Where's your grandma? She's always at the school stuff." And Amara replied, "She couldn't make it. She was traveling. Traveling. Like I was off on vacation. Like I hadn't sold Robert's wedding ring to pay for that very celebration." I pressed the phone to my chest and rocked in that hospital chair, rocking like a woman trying to calm a baby. Only this time, I was trying to calm myself. It wasn't just absence, it was erasure. The woman who had poured every dollar, every hour, every prayer into that child's education had been written out of the story like I never existed. I whispered the words to myself, tasting them bitter on my tongue. only immediate family. But I was her family, her blood. The last standing piece of Robert, the one who had kept this family from falling apart when Trevor lost his job, when bills piled up, when Carmen said, "It's too much responsibility." My hand tightened around the phone. My knuckles turned white. My heart hammered in my ears. That was when I realized I wasn't just left out of a graduation. I was being cut out of Amara's life piece by piece, with Carmen holding the scissors. And if I didn't face the truth now, I might lose her forever. I stopped scrolling. I wiped my tears. My voice, when I finally spoke into the empty hospital room, was low, sharp, dangerous. This is not the end. Not yet. Because deep down, I knew what I had just seen was only the surface. The real betrayal, the real truth, that was still waiting for me. And when it came, it made the word family mean something I never wanted it to mean. But that was only the beginning. If you've ever been cut out by family, type, "I see you" below. My life after Robert felt like one long, slow repair job. The house on Ashford had always held our small miracles. The creak in the stair that sounded like his laugh, the little dent in the dining table where he pried open bottles, the garage where his hands had turned nuts and bolts into things that would last a lifetime. After he died, everything else felt fragile. The silence in the mornings was loud. The kettle's whistle felt like someone had left the room but forgot to say goodbye. I turned my grief into work. Not for distraction, for purpose. I found that, when I had a task, the edges of the day didn't scrape so raw. I started tutoring Amara on Tuesday evenings over that old laptop with the cracked hinge. She sat cross-legged on the couch, hair in two puffs, voice bubbling through the cheap webcam. "Nana, look," she'd say, showing me a math problem she'd conquered. Her laugh was a medicine. Her little triumphs were my breathing back into a place that had nearly stopped. Saturdays were our ritual. We'd go out early to the supply store. Riverside Academy's list was long and precise. I loved the smell in those aisles. Fresh paper, new backpacks, the waxy scent of crayons. I knew which notebooks would last a school year, which pens would skip. I still remember the exact shade of blue on her uniform blazer. I bought the good scissors. I bought the glue sticks that didn't dry out. I paid for the extra math tutoring they recommended. I drove home with the trunk full and the back seat covered in tissue paper and receipts, thinking of how that trunk had once been full of Robert's tools. Money was always tight. I lived on a fixed income. Robert's life insurance, $2,000 a month, kept us going for a while, but the tuition at Riverside was a crown jewel of expense. I made choices, hard choices. I sold what I could without telling everyone. The tools Robert loved the most, the set of wedding china we kept for anniversaries, a small string of my mother's jewelry I had once promised to pass down. Each sale felt like a small funeral. I wrapped those things in paper and watched them change hands. The money bought lunches and books and enrollment fees, and I told myself, a future. I didn't broadcast it. Pride and grief make strange company. I did it quietly. I set up the life insurance payment to go to Amara's school, and every month the tuition was paid. I paid surprise fees Carmen called about at odd hours. "There's an extra charge for the musicals," she'd say breezily. "Can you swing it this month?" I would. I told myself it was worth it, for Amara, for Robert, for the idea of our family moving forward. If you've been erased by family, type "Me Too" below. People in our neighborhood knew me as Evelyn. I'd been here 40 years. Mrs. Jenkins would see me at the corner store and hand me a bag of collard greens she'd cooked that morning. Pastor Cole would ask after my serving at church and put a hand on my shoulder. Folks at the PTA recognized me. Teachers waved me into the conference room for monthly meetings. Often, I was the only one who showed up to those meetings. Trevor and Carmen were busy. "We've got it covered," Carmen would text. "Don't worry." So I'd sit in the guidance counselor's room with my notebook, the stale coffee and the hum of the fluorescent light, and I'd listen. I learned who Amara's friends were. I learned who needed help with reading. I learned more about her day than anyone else. I remember one cold afternoon in late winter, snow pressed against the car windows, when Mrs. O'Neill, Amara's homeroom teacher, looked at me across the small table and said, "Evelyn, who's the benefactor for the scholarship? We keep getting anonymous donations and sending notes to Guardian." I blinked. "What do you mean?" The teacher smiled sadly. "We thought it was a board member or an alum. Whoever it is, God bless them." I kept quiet. The truth sat heavy in my pocket like a coin I wasn't ready to spend publicly. There were other signs, small like threads that would later unravel into a rope. Carmen was always helping in public. She'd arrive at church with a smile, arm linked through Trevor's, laugh loud in the back row. She told stories that sounded harmless, a joke about in-laws, a complaint about how helpful some people could be. She'd call me silly on the phone for worrying over tiny things, then hang up and send a heart emoji. Once in passing, she said to me, "Don't worry about the invitations. I'll handle the details." Her smile was practiced. I believed her. I wanted to. I co-signed the mortgage for Trevor's house. We sat in a small office whose radiator rattled. The loan officer placed a paperweight on the stack of forms and slid a pen across the table. I remember the ink smudging a little on my thumb as my hand moved across the dotted line. I was so proud that day. I took pictures of the empty rooms with their new paint smell and promised to help furnish them. I bought an armchair with my own hands and watched Trevor and Carmen arrange it with a care that felt like ours. I thought, here's the next chapter. A son set up, a granddaughter who will graduate from the school with the best teachers, a family knit tighter. Everything I did felt like love. I told myself that being needed would be the thread that bound us. I believed my sacrifices would translate into memory and gratitude. I told myself I was doing the right thing when I wrapped the last of Robert's tools in newspaper and handed them over for a sum that would pay for a semester's fees. I told myself I was building a future, one tuition check at a time. And through it all, I still hadn't told anyone about the little things I'd sold. I hadn't told the church about the string of pearls my mother gave me and how I'd pawned them to keep a tutor for Amara. I hadn't told Trevor that his house had costs I'd quietly taken on. I kept those confessions folded like letters in the bottom of a drawer. They felt private and ashamed and necessary. Sometimes I'd sit on the back steps after dark, cigarette long gone but the hush of night keeping me company, and think of Robert's hands. I'd remember the way he'd whistle while he worked, the way he'd teach you to hold a wrench just so. I'd whisper a prayer for him and for the child that had come from our blood. I would tell myself, again and again, being needed is enough. I thought being needed was enough. I would soon learn otherwise. After that first Instagram blow, everything else started to unspool like a sweater snagged on a nail. At first the things were small, little slips that could be blamed on busy schedules, on forgetfulness. But when you live a life built from quiet sacrifices, small things have a way of piling up until they become terrible evidence. The first was a call from Amara's school. I picked up expecting to talk to Miss O'Neill about spring exams or the upcoming parent-teacher conference. Instead, I heard a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Hello, this is Riverside Academy. We have Carmen Jones listed as Amara Thompson's primary contact. We wanted to confirm the guardian's information." My throat closed. I told them who I was. There was a pause on the line, like someone searching records. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson, we have been meaning to call you." The voice was apologetic, but I could hear the confusion. "We've been sending invoices to Carmen's email. She's been coordinating things." Coordinating. The word felt thin and clinical. I sat back in my chair and felt the weight of it settle onto my shoulders. That afternoon, I walked down to the school clutching a paper bag of muffins, my little peace offering, and sat in the guidance office like a woman trying to collect a life she'd been paying for. The secretary had a file folder with Amara's name, and inside, neatly typed, was a list of emergency contacts. Carmen's number sat at the top. Under Guardian, it said simply, Carmen Jones. "What happened here?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. She looked at me with sympathy, like I'd wandered into someone else's problem. "Carmen asked us to make it official, Mrs. Thompson. She said she and Trevor would be handling school communications." The paper felt heavy in my hands. Their eyes looked at me like I was a visitor. I left the office with my muffins untouched. That was the first cut. It stung. But then came the photos, the crop, the watermark, the captions that praised Aunt Carmen for pulling everything together. A friend posted a group shot from the after party. I scrutinized it until my eyes burned. In the front row, Carmen and her family, arms linked, laughing. My arm in the back, if it was even me, was blurred and small, an afterthought. The photographer's watermark glared like a signature, L. Cortez Photography. I memorized the name, and then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I messaged the photographer. "Did you take photos at the Thompson graduation?" I typed with hands that didn't want to steady. Seconds later, he replied, "Yes. Ma'am, Trevor and Carmen booked me. I can send proofs." Booked. I stared at that word until the room tilted. Booked by the couple whose mortgage I'd co-signed, whose living room furniture I'd carried into their house with my own hands. Booked by the people I trusted. When the proofs arrived, my stomach dropped. There I was in one, cropped near the edge, smiling politely in a doorway as if I were a neighbor dropping by. My granddaughter's back was to me as she embraced Carmen's sister. I zoomed in until the pixels smeared and found on an online invoice the billing address, Carmen Jones. There was no trace of me as payer, not even the courtesy thanks to Grandma Evelyn. But money. Money was only one way Carmen was cutting me out. She was polishing a version of our family where I was an inconvenient relic. At church, she told a small story about relatives being so old-fashioned. The punchline aimed at me. Folks laughed. I smiled through it like a woman whose jaw had gone numb. Neighbors began to speak in rehearsed tones. Mrs. Bailey from across the street handed me a casserole and lowered her voice. "Carmen mentioned you were overbearing," she said, looking at the sidewalk as if the concrete might swallow the truth. The word stung because it came from someone I'd watched grow up. Later, at the beauty shop, a woman I'd known for 20 years slid a folded note across the counter. Someone had asked if I was the same Evelyn who had been paying for that school. The implication was too polite to be harmless. Carmen's manipulations weren't always loud. Often they were the small, precise things that made me question my own memory. One week, an invitation to a parent brunch arrived 3 days late, stamped and folded in an envelope with a glossy photo on the front. I held it and felt the edges like a physical wound. I had been told, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll send it." I had trusted her voice. I'd believed the invitation would be in my hands a month earlier. I tried to talk to her once, gently. We were at Trevor's house. Her kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner. The counters gleamed. A casserole dish steamed on the counter. "Carmen," I said, "I didn't get the date for the graduation. I thought you were going to let everyone know." She smiled, too bright. "Oh, Mama Evelyn, it was such a small thing. We wanted it intimate. You know how it is." "We didn't want a fuss." She reached out to touch my arm, and I felt the touch as if through glass. "You know I love Amara. Let me handle it, okay?" Handle it. The same word again. Each time she used it, it felt less like help and more like permission to take over. Trevor hovered in the doorway like a man trapped between two pictures, his wife's laughter and his mother's hurt. "Mom, please," he said once in a low voice when I stood up too quickly at dinner. "Don't make it difficult. Carmen's trying." Trying for what? I wanted to ask. Trying to erase me? Instead, I sat down and folded my hands. Sometimes she called with small financial requests that seemed innocent at first. "We had an unexpected club fee. Can you help?" The uniform needed hemming. We weren't expecting the cost. They were little arrows, each one finding the same place in my wallet I had been careful to keep for her. I paid because my heart wouldn't let me do otherwise. I told myself I was investing in her future. I told myself these were small prices for the inheritance of love. What made everything worse was the way Carmen told the story to other people. To some, she painted me as a meddling mother who needed to step back. To others, she presented herself as the martyr, the one who kept peace. I learned this from neighbors, from hushed phone calls, from the casual way people began to treat me at dinners and church social hours. "She means well," people would say, patting my hand, "but you know how children are." The pity was a kind of poisoning. Then came the teacher, who couldn't figure out the donor. Miss O'Neill pulled me aside one afternoon, concern softening her voice. "Mrs. Thompson, we recently received tuition assistance for Amara's summer program, and someone paid under the name Guardian. There's a file of checks going back months. We didn't know who to thank." I felt the ticketed receipts in my pocket like a confession. The school assumed someone else. The school's assumption became Carmen's cover. That's when I realized the truth. Subscribe for the full story. If you're still not subscribing, tell me in the comments. What's holding you back? I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I began to check my accounts more. I started keeping copies of receipts, saving text messages, taking screenshots of payments I'd made. Evidence, I told myself. If you're going to be cut out, at least you should know how they did it. But evidence didn't always heal. Sometimes it only made the wound feel more real. When I confronted Carmen with a receipt once, she rolled her eyes. "Mom, girl, that's been ages. Don't act like you don't understand grown folks have their own systems." She tossed the phrase off casually, the insult wrapped like a ribbon. "Grown folks?" I echoed. "You mean like people who erase the woman who paid for their child's education?" Trevor stepped between us, voice small. "Mom, please, don't do this now." "Do what?" I asked. "Say the truth?" My voice was hoarse. The room felt too bright. The lemon smell felt like an accusation. That night, I lay awake and thought of the mortgage papers, the smudged ink on my thumb when I co-signed, the tools Robert had used. I thought of the pearls I'd sold, the wedding china I'd boxed up and walked away from. I thought of every time Carmen had laughed in my face and told me to let it go. I thought of the way my granddaughter's photo on social media could be curated so perfectly that the person who made it possible did not exist. And I realized this wasn't simply about money. It was about story. Carmen was not just taking credit, she was rewriting the narrative so that my name, the name that had paid, that had loved, that had carried this family, was no longer necessary. But that wasn't the last thing she did, I told myself, turning the phrase over like a stone in my mouth. I could feel the next thing coming, like thunder building on a summer horizon. I didn't yet know what shape it would take, only that the pattern of small manipulations would harden into a more dangerous geometry, and I would have to decide whether to keep paying for the life they were building without me or to stop and watch what fell apart. When I asked the photographer for prints, I saw something I didn't expect. 8 days after the graduation, the morning light seeped through the curtains like an insult. I was still in the habit of waking before the sun. The house felt the way it had since Robert died, too quiet, as if every room held its breath, waiting. On the kitchen table sat the little things I'd been putting off: an IRS envelope, a stack of unpaid bills, a note with the dentist appointment scribbled in Trevor's handwriting. The kettle had left a pale ring on the tablecloth where I'd set my mug last night, small domestic evidence of a life I was still keeping together. The phone rang like a bell. It sounded bright in the room, too bright. For a second, I thought maybe it was a wrong number. Then I saw Carmen's name on the screen. I felt a small surge of something, hope, obligation, I don't know. My hand hovered before I answered. "Hello?" I said. Her voice came through, syrupy sweet and practiced. "Hi, Mama Evelyn. I hope Claudine's resting okay." She used my name the way she used sugar, sparingly, to make something taste better. I kept my voice small. She's sleeping. The doctor says she's stable. I tried to keep the conversation light. There was a pause, then the ask. She said it like she was listing the weather, like it was ordinary, like it was nothing. Riverside Prep requires a $5,000 deposit by Friday, and the summer tutoring program is another $3,200. We need the deposit to secure Amara's spot, and the tutor, well, you know how important it is for her reading. Can you help with both? She sounded sincere, but she sounded too calm. I remember the way the numbers landed, cold and clinical, in the room. 5,000, 3,200, $8,200. I tasted metal on my tongue, the old hospital tang I'd been living with last week. For a moment, I thought I misheard, so I asked her to repeat it. 5,000 for the deposit, she said again, crisp as a bill, and 3,200 for summer tutoring by Friday. That's when her mask slipped. Subscribe if you want the full story. If you're still not subscribing, tell me in the comments, what's holding you back? My breath left me in a little sound. I think the kettle boiled over then in the other room and I didn't notice. I remember thinking of the invoices I'd already paid. I remembered the dress. I remembered the photographer's watermark. I felt the ghost of every check I had written for Amara rise up behind my eyes. What? I said, too loud. Carmen, that's... Oh, Mama, she interrupted, the voice honeyed. We only want what's best for Amara. You know that. You've always done so much. The compliment was a trap. I had a picture in my head of the professional photographer's invoice, of the proofs with glossy smiles, of bills that had Carmen's name printed as the booking contact. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My hand went to my chest as if I could steady the rising panic. Then Carmen said it. She said the thing that made my world tilt. You always can, Evelyn, she said, as if telling me a secret. You always have. We rely on you. We rely on you. It landed like a verdict. My silence stretched like a rope. I heard my own heartbeat like a drum in my ears. The room was very bright. I saw the IRS envelope, and I thought about the last of Robert's tools and about the pearls I'd pawned quietly, and something inside me decided it had been enough. No, I said. The word was small at first. No? She asked. Bewilderment fitted into a smile I could feel through the line. No, I said again, louder. My throat tightened. No, Carmen. I will not be the safety net for your household while you erase me from my granddaughter's life. There was a shift on the other end. The sweet voice hardened. Evelyn, she began. Never again, I said. The words left me like someone closing a door. Never again will I pay for a celebration I'm not allowed to attend. Never again will I finance my own exclusion. Silence. Then a sound like a snapped cord, a laugh that was too sharp to be a laugh. Ungrateful, she said after a breath. You're ungrateful. After everything. Ungrateful, I echoed. The word felt cheap in her mouth. Ungrateful for what, Carmen? For loving my granddaughter enough to sell the last of what Robert left me? Her voice rose. You don't understand how boundaries work. You don't... She stopped herself. You always overstep. Overstep? I felt the old tautness of anger unspool inside me, a cord that had been knotted for years. I co-signed a mortgage for your family. I paid for furniture. I paid for the dress. I paid for the photographer. I paid... You're being dramatic, Carmen cut in. You're being... This is exactly what I was worried about. You'll make this a scene. By then, Trevor had come on the line. I heard his breath, the little hitch he always makes when he's unsure. Mom, he said, softer than I'd ever heard him. Mom, please don't make it difficult. Carmen handled everything. He said it like someone reading from a script. His voice sounded small, like a man who had been swallowed by something larger than himself. I could hear his hesitation. He had the sound of someone trying to hold two truths at once. "Trevor," I said, Are you asking me to give her money after she left me out of my granddaughter's graduation?" There was the clatter of a utensil, then Trevor's reply, brittle, almost breaking. "You're too controlling, Mom. You have to respect our boundaries." Respect our boundaries. The words fell like a gavel. Trevor's choice was made. He had folded himself inside his wife's plan. He had chosen the comfort of the house over the truth of where that comfort came from. I heard him hang up. The line went dead with a small, final click. When Trevor hung up, I could hear the line go dead, and something in me cracked. I sat at the table, and the world felt loud and thin at the edges. My hands trembled. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon, the same way Trevor's wife always kept that house, bright and clean. The couch in Trevor's living room, the one I'd bought, sat in a photograph on Carmen's page looking new and arranged. The fabric still carried the scent of my hands where I had carried it into their home. I reached for the stack of papers. I took a breath like a woman who was about to open a wound. I pulled out my phone and I searched for the receipts I'd saved, the screenshots, the emails. I looked for proof the way a widow looks for a heartbeat in a dark room. There were messages, texts Carmen had sent to friends, casual little notes where she twined lies into compliments. "We kept it intimate," she wrote to one. "Mom couldn't make it." To another, "I handled everything so it would be special." There was an email correspondence with the photographer. The booking form listed Carmen Jones as the payer. I clicked on the attached invoice. I found the invoice that proved everything, and it had my name on it. It was a photocopy someone had made, an old hand-scribbled receipt with a line through the original payer and another name written in. My name appeared in the scrawl, but a later, typed invoice had Carmen's billing address. On the proof for prints, someone had written, "Thanks to Grandma," and then crossed it out. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. My stomach turned like water in a pan. I had paid for the dress. I had paid the photographer. I had paid for the tassel and the corsage and the extra printing of photos. I had wired money for summer tutoring years before because Carmen called and said a fee had come up. I had paid because that was what you do for your family, especially for the child you loved like your own. But the receipts could be altered. The emails could be forwarded with a new header. The social media posts could be written to erase what actually happened. Carmen had done a careful, slow thing. She had rewritten the family ledger so that her role read larger, and mine read small, if it appeared at all. I remember standing at Trevor's mailbox later that day, holding a stack of glossy prints the photographer had finally sent. On the back of one, in small handwriting, someone, maybe an assistant, wrote, "Booking, Carmen J." On another, a sticky note, "Paid by Grandma Evelyn?" The question mark sat on the page like an accusation. I laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "I paid for her dress," I told the empty air. "I paid for the photographer." I said it again, louder. "I paid for her dress. I paid for the photographer." The repetition steadied me. Saying it named the theft. And there was a moment, a tiny, hot, bright thing, when I could feel the history of my life with Robert and the quiet work I had done for this family line up behind me like a small army. I could feel the bills and the pawned jewelry and the nights at the hospital. I felt the weight of every little sacrifice and the sudden, sharp revelation that those sacrifices had been weaponized against me as if I were a resource to be consumed and then discarded. Something in me shifted. I thought of dignity. I thought of all the Sundays at church, all the meetings at the school, all the times I'd been the one to show up. I thought of the small children who now came to the education fund at my church, and I thought of what my money could do if it were directed somewhere it was wanted. I set the prints down. I smoothed the couch cover I had once bought and felt its texture under my palms. I took my keys from the hook. I could feel my hands steadying themselves like a woman picking up a tool she had used for years. I made myself a decision in a small, clear voice. Never again, I whispered first, as if testing the wind. Then I said it out loud. To the empty kitchen, and to the bills, and to the pile of receipts, and to the photograph where my face was small, cropped to the edge. Never again will I fund my own humiliation. The words rang in the room, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a measure of calm. If you had to choose dignity over connection, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I knew what it would mean. I knew the price. I knew the risk of losing daily, casual access to Amara. I knew the way Trevor would harden, how Carmen would narrate me to the neighbors, the pastors, the teachers. I knew I might have to face gossip and isolation and the sting of one more betrayal. But I also knew I had given enough. I had a finite life and a heart that could only be stretched so far. If to keep my dignity I had to step away from a table that had been set for me without my name, then that was a price I could bear. I made one more call, not to Carmen, not to Trevor. I called a lawyer I had once met in church who did pro bono work for seniors. I called the PTA president. I called Mrs. Jenkins, who'd always made the best collard greens. I told them simply that I was stopping payments, that I would redirect what I could to the church fund we'd talked about. Then I sat and waited for the fallout, and when it came, hot and immediate and loud, I did not flinch. When I hung up that day and said, "Never again," I thought the worst thing would be silence. I thought maybe Carmen would fume for a little while, and then we'd go back to the old, ugly arrangements. I had not imagined how quickly things would turn. I had not imagined how loud betrayal can sound when someone decides to make you invisible. She didn't sulk, she attacked. The next morning, she stood at Trevor's kitchen counter and screamed into her phone, loud enough that I could hear the tone through the thin walls of my own living room. "She's controlling. She's always controlled everything." I could feel the words like stones thrown through a window. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened it to Carmen's sister with a forced smile and a casserole. She put the pan down, and before she left, she said in a voice small and quick, "We're worried, Evelyn. You know, boundaries." Her eyes slid away. The casserole sat on my counter like a trophy for humiliation. Neighbors shifted. Mrs. Bailey from next door pressed a casserole into my arms and said, "We're praying for you," and then glanced at me in that little way neighbors do when they've been told one thing at church and another down the street. Pastor Cole offered a gentle hand at Sunday service, his palm warm, but his words careful. Some people kept their distance as if contagion might pass through proximity, through association with conflict. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations grew short. The empty chair at the church luncheon where I always sat became, in a way I could feel, an accusation. The hardest and most immediate damage was to Amara. That was the part of this I had never truly been able to armor myself against, the child. Without the tutoring I had quietly paid for, the extra practice that had kept her a step ahead, she began to wobble. A note came home in her backpack one October afternoon, folded into a paper towel. "Please see note about Amara's reading." I held that note over the kitchen sink and felt like the floor had dropped out of me. At the parent-teacher meeting, Miss O'Neill, who had the kindness of someone who teaches because she loves it, looked at me across the table and said softly, "She's missing the practice. Summer gaps widened, and I see it in her confidence." The words landed like wet cloth. I thought of every worksheet I'd sat with her, every hour of my life that had gone into turning her reading into something she loved. Now she was quieter, sitting with her backpack strap, looking tired in a way no child should be. Carmen tried everything. She took a second job 2 towns over, late nights, early mornings, and the house grew empty in different ways. She borrowed money from people who didn't ask where it would go. When the loan came due, There was a fight that spilled into the street one evening. I listened from my porch as neighbors said things I never thought I'd hear in this neighborhood. "She's desperate," one said. "It's sad," said another. And then came the legal threats, all polite and procedural and designed to terrify. Carmen began whispering custody, citing boundaries and parental rights in the kind of language that sounds reasonable to anyone who hasn't held the receipts of another person's life. She told Trevor, "We can make this clean, and we can just move." When someone dresses a threat in the language of law, it looks like order. It looks like logic. People listen. So I sat in a lawyer's office that smelled like peppermint gum and paper, in a leather chair that sat too high for me, and I explained why I'd stopped paying. The lawyer's pen clicked. He asked for documentation. Transfers, bank statements, screenshots, anything that could show a pattern of financial coercion or custodial interference. The words he used were blunt and factual, and the room hummed like an appliance. "Legally," he said, "you have a moral case. But the law wants paperwork." I felt the shame of it, sitting there with a folder of my life's small proofs as if confessing to a judge. Still, he told me what to do: gather receipts, keep records, consider mediation recorded by counsel. The thing about public stories is they can turn, and sometimes they do it in a way you don't expect. One quiet Monday morning, an email appeared in my inbox that I still read again when my heart needs reminding. Subject, PTA. Recognition and thanks. I clicked. Miss O'Neill had written a note to the PTA list, private, then forwarded, and she'd named me. She wrote that donations and summer program fees for several students had come from a guardian, and that upon investigation, those donations were traced to me. She asked the PTA to help recognize the grandmother who'd been doing this work quietly. Then the PTA email landed in my inbox. When my name was finally spoken, did it change anything? Tell me in the comments. My hands shook. For the first time in weeks, someone else had spoken my truth out loud. Word moved faster than the gossip. People called. Some came by with casseroles, others came with apologies sewn into their voices. Pastor Cole called me that afternoon and said, "We will mention you on Sunday, Evelyn. You should be known." Mrs. Jenkins from the corner store dropped off biscuits and said, "Child, we had no idea." The small public naming of my contribution forced a reprieve against the story Carmen had been telling. It didn't undo the pain, but it opened a door. That public note shifted the town's whispers into questions. Carmen tried to fight back. She told her side, "She wants credit, she wants attention." She told anyone who would listen. But the PTA's note had planted seeds. Some neighbors who had quietly repeated Carmen's lines now found themselves uncertain. When people asked me, I told small, simple truths: life insurance, a few sold things, a lot of late nights balancing bills. I did not tell everything. The wedding china stayed boxed in the attic. The ring I had let go of beneath a pawn ticket kept its place folded into my wallet like a private ache. Then late one night, 2 a.m, my phone woke me. It was Trevor. He was shaking so badly I could hear it through the line. "Mom," he said, voice small as a boy again. I lost my job." He didn't call for money. He called because the part of him that was still my child needed a lap to rest on. He told me about the meeting, the pileup of layoffs. He told me about the look on his manager's face, the cardboard box they gave him. He said he was scared. He said he felt foolish for having let money be the measure of his life. He sounded raw and small, and something inside me softened in a way I hadn't allowed in months. I drove to his house with a thermos of tea and sat on the couch I'd helped furnish. He curled up against me and we both cried in that plain way that doesn't fix anything but lets the weight find a place to rest. There, in the quiet after the tears, he scrolled his phone and showed me messages I'd already seen. He looked at me with new eyes, tired, embarrassed, honest. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought she was handling it. I didn't see how she was changing things." Trevor called in the middle of the night. He was shaking. Stories like this happen daily. Subscribe so you don't miss them. If you're still not subscribing, tell me in the comments. What's holding you back? His vulnerability didn't undo the damage. It didn't erase the way Trevor had sided with comfort over truth when his wife demanded it. But it was a crack. It was a place where light might one day find purchase. He didn't choose me that night as a champion. He chose me as a harbor. That, to me, felt like a beginning. Amara's confusion came in a small, folded note months later. She left it in my purse the day she visited, fingers sticky from a juice box. "Grandma," it read in slanted letters, "why didn't you come? We made a video and you weren't in it." I read it on the bus home, thumb worrying at the crease. The words were simple, and they cut clean. Her teacher sent more notes. "She's quieter," Miss O'Neill wrote. "She asks about family members at odd times. She asks why people she knows aren't around." A child's confusion is a mirror that reveals more than debates about boundaries ever could. Her pain was immediate, and I could not fix it with emails or PTA notes. It required time, truth, and, I hoped, eventually, context. So I did the thing that surprised them most. I stopped hiding from my own life and started living into it. I booked the trip Robert and I had always promised ourselves, just small, ordinary things we kept putting off. I walked streets in Paris that smelled like butter and coffee, and on a balcony in Florence, the wind smelled of stone and old poems. I read Robert's old notes and laughed at his terrible jokes until my face ached. It wasn't an escape, it was reclamation. Back home, I joined a support group at church. We met in a basement room with chipped paint and folding chairs. People came with stories about being edged out by children, about being thanked with absence. We traded recipes and tears and tips about how to keep records when your heart has been used as an ATM. Those women, grandparents who had been pushed aside, held me in a way the rest of the town didn't. We formed a small council of dignity. With the money I had been spending to prop up an illusion, I started an education fund through the church. The first ceremony was small. Pastor Cole's voice, a plaque that read, "For children who need a chance," and a line of small hands reaching for books. I put in the first deposit myself. Children lined up for a tutoring workshop, and the sound of that, little voices, questions, the rustle of pages, felt like a salve. It was not Amara's private tutor. It was public and open and honest. There were small victories. Miss O'Neill stood at the PTA meeting and publicly thanked me for the donations that had come anonymously. A slap of applause broke across the room. A neighbor brought over a bowl of peach cobbler and said, "Girl, I was wrong to listen to gossip." Yet the fallout had real teeth. Carmen's narrative lingered with some. The law was slow to move. Tweets that had nothing to do with us carried opinions. I still waited for the settlement of things, for the dust to actually settle. I kept a small list in my wallet, receipts, screenshots, the pawn ticket. I kept a note that read, I still hadn't told anyone about the house, the ring, the wedding china. Some things remained private. Some things, maybe, would never be explained fully. Through all of it, the question followed me like a shadow. Had I done the right thing by choosing dignity over a daily presence that required continued humiliation? I think of Amara's note in my purse. I think of Trevor's shaking voice. I think of Pastor Cole's quiet hand. The price was steep. The lesson was necessary. Amara left me a note that I still carry in my purse. Share this with a friend who needs to hear it. The morning after I decided, never again, dawned different. Light slid through the curtains in a slow, honest way, not the hurried slant of someone trying to hide from shame. I made coffee and held the mug in both hands like it was an offering. Steam rose and smudged the window for a second. There was a small, quiet relief in that ordinary ritual. In the clink of the spoon, the warm weight of the cup, the slow inhale that said I was still here. A week later, passport in my drawer, I found myself on a plane with a single suitcase and Robert's old letters tucked into the lining. The smell of the plane's recycled air was ordinary, but stepping into Paris felt like stepping into permission. Croissant ovens breathed butter into the morning. I sat on a small balcony with a paper cup of coffee and let the city climb into my chest. I read Robert's handwriting aloud to myself, his ridiculous penmanship, his small jokes, and I laughed until my cheeks ached. For once, my grief and my joy could hold a room together. There was a museum in Florence where a painting hung so quietly I forgot to breathe. A woman beside me smiled, and it surprised me, the ease of it. I felt something loosen, like an old belt cut and fall away. In those streets, I remembered why Robert and I had kept promising each other small travel plans, not to run from sorrow, but to keep living. I bought a small seashell and put it in my bag for Amara, thinking of a future conversation I wasn't yet ready to have. Coming home felt different. The house still held its memories, the dent in the table, the smell of lemon cleaner, the quiet of the kitchen, but I came back with pockets full of small decisions. I joined the grandparents' support group at the church basement. Folding chairs, paper napkins, soft voices. We traded stories like currency, about being sidelined, about being taken for granted, about the blunt loneliness of loving someone who won't see the ledger. Those women held my shame and handed it back to me as something I could carry with grace. The education fund grew slowly. The first workshop I hosted felt like the first day of school all over again. Little feet shuffled, pencils clicked, names were learned. Pastor Cole put up a plaque in the fellowship hall. I watched his hand rub the brass and felt a small heat in my chest. The inscription read, "For children who need a chance." I put the first deposit in with my own hands. I watched a child's face light when she sounded out a word she'd never managed before. That light was worth more than any party I'd ever been excluded from. I still kept little secrets in the attic. The box with the wedding china, the folded ribbon from Robert's watch, the tiny pawn ticket that once meant I had let go of the ring. I took them down sometimes and ran my fingers over the tissue paper. I slept well without those things. There is a peace in having done right by yourself. 18 months later, a letter came that caught the air out of me. The envelope was folded small and timid, handwriting a little shaky. Amara's school handwriting, the kind you teach in first grade. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it slow, like unwrapping a small gift. Her words were simple. "Nana," she wrote, "school is hard. I miss you at the games." "Why didn't you come?" "The teacher asked about you." I cried. "Are you mad?" "Love, Amara." My hands went cold. I read it twice. I read it a third time and let the lines sink in. The child had not been told the whole story. She'd been given a curio. Traveling, they said. She held a hole where I had been. The note fit into my palm like a small, blunt instrument, and it cut clean. I wrote back in slow, careful sentences. I told her truth without the weaponized detail that might confuse a child. I wrote, "My sweet girl, there are things adults sometimes do that you won't understand yet. I love you more than the sky. I stopped giving money when it made me small and sad. I chose dignity because I want to be proud when I come to your life, not used. When you are older and ready to hear everything, come to me. I will always have a seat at my table for you." I folded that letter and slipped it into the mail with hands that shook a little. It was honest and it was kind. It was both an explanation and an invitation. She wrote back months later. The paper from a child is different. Large loops, the occasional backward letter. She ended the letter with one question I read and reread. "Do you still love me?" I keep that question on a small note tucked into the back of my Bible. I read it when the nights are quiet and the old ache comes smelling like hospital bleach. I answered her carefully. I wrote, "Always." My love does not depend on being invited to a party. It depends on a promise I made once, to be there in ways that do not hurt me. When you are ready, come. We will talk. We will laugh. We will make new memories that do not cost you shame. The promise felt both heavy and light. I had chosen dignity and the road it asked me to walk. I had also chosen to leave the door open. Love, I decided, needs bones. It needs boundaries to hold it upright. It needs a table with room for truth. I still carry the echoes of the other lines. The phrase Carmen used, only immediate family, that first punch. I still say to myself, sometimes out loud, I paid for her dress, I paid for the photographer. Saying it names the truth. Saying it steadies me. If there is a single thing this whole long storm taught me, it is this. Losing the small daily things you loved hurts in ways you cannot always predict. But reclaiming a life filled with honest work and honest gifts, those are things no one can take without being seen. I lost a granddaughter's daily presence, but I found back my life. What would you have done in my place? If you like this story, share it with someone who needs it. For more life stories, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you're still not subscribing, tell me below. What's holding you back? Drop your city and country flag below. Let's see where we're all watching from.